internet and social media for young people. We've done experiments and we've done cross-sectional and longitudinal study to investigate the effects or the relationship between social media use and self-concept clarity and self-esteem, social competence, the quality of friendship initiation, online sexual risk-taking and cyberbullying and many more. And you know, the object of our study is a moving target. Oftentimes, the tools we use in our research already get outdated before our results are published. And here I give you the latest figures on social media use, and as you will see, social media use has globalized enormously. 10 years ago, in the Netherlands, we had our own Dutch apps and tools, social media tools. But now, this is a Dutch slide, but you see that the tools used are international. WhatsApp, SMS, text messaging. WhatsApp is by far most popular in the Netherlands, and I think in many other countries as well. Traditional SMS is still used, but only when adolescents don't have Wi-Fi available. And then you see Snapchat. Snapchat is now the third one, but it has risen enormously in the past month, so I think it's higher up, it's above SMS right now. And then you see Telegram and Click. These are the social media that are used for personal communication, mostly one-to-one communication. And these are the social media that are used for group communication. And you see that YouTube is the most popular one, closely followed by Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You see all international names, Google+, and you see that I'm sure that Instagram has become very, very popular in the past months. So I think that Instagram has now surpassed Twitter. If you want to investigate the social effects of social media or media and technology, you can basically rely on or contribute to two types of theories. First, mass communication theories. And these theories arose in the 1920s as a response to the new opportunities to reach large audiences via the mass media, the press, the radio, and the movies. And these theories, they find their origin in sociology and political communication. But you can also rely on or contribute to computer-mediated communication theories, CMC theories. And these theories arose in the 1970s, long before the internet became popular, and they find their origins in interpersonal communication and social psychology. Both theories share some parallels. First, both mass media and CMC theories acknowledge that external factors co-influence or moderate the communication process. In the early theories, these external factors were named noise, but we now see these external factors as highly relevant. And they also both acknowledge that recipients of communication have some degree of agency. That is, they are autonomous in how they perceive or decode media and communication. However, both mass media effect theories and research and computer-mediated communication research, CMC research, they are still too often based in a reception model. The notion that certain content or other properties of media or technologies have a unidirectional impact on recipients. Mass media effects research is, for instance, still based on the idea that certain properties of mass media, such as modality, auditory, visual, or name it, or structure, special effects, visual surprises, or content, influences how people are affected by media. And the same holds for CMC theories, especially the older ones. They still focus on the effects of certain CMC characteristics, for example, asynchronicity, whether you can press the button immediately or delayed, or anonymity, visual anonymity, and they think that these characteristics affect a recipient. What this basically means is that both types of theories have paid lots of attention to interpersonal processes, but far less to intrapersonal processes of both the recipient and the sender. And they still do not recognize enough that in the newer media environment, recipients of communication are also senders of communication. And that's a phenomenon for which the now somewhat obsolete term prosumers was coined. And what has been overlooked largely until recently is that these senders cannot only influence recipients by their communication, but also themselves. And this phenomenon that our own online communicative behavior influence ourselves has been referred to as an online expression effect. And in the past decades, we have often found that adolescents change not as much as a recipient of communication, but as a result of their own online communicative behavior. And such online expression effects are, of course, highly relevant in adolescence. After all, intrapersonal changes in self-concept are normative in adolescence. Adolescence is marked by 3 developmental goals. The adolescents need to form an identity, they need to form intimacy, form close friendship and romantic relationship, and they have to form a sexual self. These are intrapersonal changes. And what we have found in the past 10 years is that some of the affordances of social media, the opportunities they offer the user, facilitate expression effects related to the 3 developmental goals: identity, intimacy, and sexuality. And one such affordance is reduced cues. Users of social media can choose whether they want to have audiovisual cues or not. So they can, if they want, hide their pimples or a bad hair day. And they can also, another affordance is the edibility. They can endlessly optimize their visual and verbal self-presentation. And asynchronicity, what I just said, they can also decide, do I press the send button now or do I wait a while so I can still work on it? And what we found is that these affordances of social media, what we found is that the importance that adolescents attach to these affordances predicts their perceived controllability. That's not controllability objectively, but their perceived controllability. It's maybe an illusion of controllability. And controllability means that they have the freedom to decide what, how, when, and to whom they communicate. And this perceived controllability in turns is related to the 3 developmental goals in adolescence. And now you think, why is this the case? Why is perceived controllability related to the 3 developmental goals? And that is because perceived controllability of online communication facilitates the practice, the rehearsal of 3 developmental skills that are necessary to accomplish the developmental goals. And now you think, such a complicated process, so simple in one model. And now I'm going to give you some examples of our research in the past 10 years on the 3 developmental skills. And I start with self-presentation. We have seen that mere writing a blog, for example, can change the writer's self-esteem and their identity. They think that others understand them better because of writing the blogs. And that's an indirect expression, that's a direct expression effect. But expression effect can also occur indirectly. And we have seen that with teenagers' self-presentation on social network sites. These sites, social network sites, are designed that users give themselves positive feedback, and that's what we saw. 93% of 10 to 19 years old, they mostly receive positive feedback. And that's logical, because these sites they stimulate positive feedback. What we also found is that their use of this social network site, the more they used it, the more feedback they received, which is logical too, because the more they use it, the higher the chance that they get feedback. But that's not the only thing. The more feedback they received, the more they started to adjust their profile based on this feedback. And they made it more attractive. They optimized their profile. And this optimization of this profile led to even more positive feedback. And eventually, it enhanced their self-esteem. So by creating their own feedback, their own positive feedback, they enhance their own self-esteem. Another example. The second developmental skill, self-disclosure. And that's the skill to adequately disclose yourself intimately to friends. And it's a crucial skill in adolescence. It has been related with friendship formation, friendship quality, emotional support, well-being, etc. And in our project, we created scales to measure online and offline self-disclosure to close friends, with items such as how much do you tell about your worries, about being in love, about the things you are ashamed of, your secrets, etc. And I'm going to tell you, here you see a graph where we have plotted online and offline self-disclosure, and on the left for girls and on the right for boys. And what you see for girls is that, and you see that the highest curve is for offline self-disclosure and the lower for online. What you see for girls, when they are 10, a sharp increase in both online and offline intimate self-disclosure. And when you compare that with boys, you see that this process starts around 2 years later, at around 13 and 14 years. But what is more interesting, although you see that for both groups, offline self-disclosure is higher than online self-disclosure, there are huge individual differences. For example, in the boys group, 30% of boys disclose more online than offline about intimate topics such as being in love and things you are ashamed of. So it's for boys stronger than for girls. For girls it's 22, but still 22% of girls prefer online self-disclosure about intimate topics to offline self-disclosure. Now, the next, what we wanted to investigate is how the two types of self-disclosure are related. And we had two hypotheses. One is the displacement hypothesis. We thought it can be possible if they disclose online, they don't disclose offline anymore. But we also tested the rehearsal hypothesis. And that predicts that adolescents use online self-disclosure to practice, to rehearse, and they later start to disclose offline. And we see in this graph, this is a three-wave longitudinal study in which we measured both types of self-disclosure. And what we see is only a path from online self-disclosure at time 1 to offline, which is support for the rehearsal hypothesis. Because if there was, we would have a displacement hypothesis, we would have seen negative relationships over time between going from online self-disclosure to offline. So what we see here is that adolescents seem to use the internet to explore intimacy-related issue with their close friends. And we also know that since Web 2.0 applications, that adolescents communicate mostly with their existing friends. In the 90s, when we had newsrooms, chat rooms, it was more that they used the internet to talk to strangers, but nowadays most adolescents use it to talk to their friends. In another longitudinal study, we investigated the effects of this online self-disclosure to their friendship. And what we found is that their own online self-disclosure was related to their perceptions of friendships at time 2. So social media use led to higher online self-disclosure, and this higher online self-disclosure led to higher perceptions of the quality of the closeness of their friends. The third social skill, sexual exploration. In one of our earliest studies, we found that pre-adolescents, 9 to 12 years old, they experiment almost 3 times as much with their identity than late adolescents. They most frequently pretended to be older, more beautiful, sexier, and for the boys, more macho. And, you know, looking for pornography on the web has become normative behavior in adolescence. Here are our most recent preferences, and you see that how often early and late adolescents deliberately search for sexual information on the internet, and you see they often do it together, and they have great fun when they do it. But you also see, and you see that boys, and you also see here how often they are accidentally exposed to such information. And remarkably, you see that boys are deliberately far more often expose themselves to pornography. But remarkably, boys also accidentally are exposed more often than girls to pornography. And we still don't understand this latter result. Although exchanging sexual information between partners is normative behavior in adolescence, when you do it on the internet, it's because of the distributability and the permanence, it's often risk behavior. And we have also investigated risk behavior. And you see here on this graph that a small percentage of adolescents engage in sexting, sexual risk behavior, send nude photos to each other, talk about sexual topics, and search for partners to have sex. And here you see we used this is based on a 4-wave panel study, and we used accelerated cohort sequential design with age as the time variable. And you see here, this is online sexual risk behavior. You see that there's a peak around 15 and 16 years. And if you compare that with offline sexual risk behavior, you see another path. These are the high risk takers. You see that it starts later. And we know that the average age that teenagers have sexual intercourse is around 17 years. And they start with online sexual risk behavior earlier than offline sexual risk behavior. Conclusion. We have done far more studies than I could show now on that indicate that adolescents change because of their own communicative behavior. We have mostly found positive expression effects. And these are related to their self-esteem, their social competence, their friendship initiation, their perceived friendship quality and well-being. However, we also found that 5 to 10% of adolescents are bullied online. We also found that about 5% engage in sexual risk-taking, that 7% get mainly negative reactions on their online profile, and that 5% of adolescents are compulsive gamers or compulsive social media users. And we have also found negative effects, small negative effects of their exposure to pornography on their attitudes about sex and to women. And you know, these small relationships, they suggest that there are, in this case, also huge individual differences in susceptibility. Expression effects, research into expression effects has hardly investigated individual differences. And this is, in my idea, an important task for future research. Thanks for your attention. You can follow our publications. We publish everything online. And if you are interested, everything I told can be found on our website. Thanks for your attention.
My name is Marian Underwood, as I said, and the title of my talk will be The BlackBerry Project, Capturing the Hidden World of Adolescents' Digital Communication. I bring the perspective of a child clinical psychologist who has always been fascinated by aggressive behavior. And as someone who studies aggression, I've had long-standing distrust of self-report measures. So in my observational work on aggression, I've always tried to watch behavior. And I got into studying digital communication because students in my longitudinal study were coming into the lab clutching cell phones and texting. I was asking them to interact in front of cameras, and they were, much to their parents' mortification, desperate to text on their cell phones. And I realized, what if I just captured their digital communication? It would be such a window into their social world. It's been an honor and an adventure to see the content of adolescents, text messaging, Facebook, and now Twitter and Instagram also. So I really thank the families and the children who participated in this longitudinal study for 9 solid years. I am also very grateful to the National Institutes of Health for their ongoing support for this work. So pioneers studying internet communication realized early on that online communication is a real window into the world of adolescent peer culture, and that the internet could be a context onto which adolescents project normative developmental issues, such as identity development and sexuality. In recent years, adolescents have become heavily engaged in a different type of digital communication, text messaging. And all of these statistics, almost all of them, are from the Pew Foundation. So these are survey studies conducted in the United States. Text messaging likely provides really important developmental opportunities for close communication with peers, micro-social planning, literally saying, you know, I'm at the movies, where are you, figuring out where to meet, communicating about schoolwork, and exchanging all kinds of information. This is too many statistics to read, but let me just draw your attention to a couple. 54% of adolescents contact friends daily via text messaging. When you ask adolescents how they prefer to communicate with friends, they say they prefer text messaging over all other forms of communication, including face-to-face interaction. In one study, 54% of girls and 40% of boys reported that their social lives would end or be greatly worsened if they could not text. Rich Ling has pointed out that texting is probably a life phase phenomenon, a practice prized in adolescence because it is inexpensive, it is discreet to the point of being almost subversive. It can be done in many situations in which cell phone calling and internet communication aren't possible. It is more private from adults. It is easier for parents to spy on your Facebook messaging than it is for them to spy on your text messaging. It's more private. And it's a forum in which youth can play with slang and develop their own language for interaction. So many people have maligned adolescents' digital communication, and people sort of are of two extremes. They think it's silly and not worth studying, or they think it's terrible and ruining in-person relationships. You hear a lot of talk about adolescents being addicted to their phones or addicted to digital communication, and I think it's important to stand back and to realize that young people are intensely engaged in this form of communication because it meets their basic developmental needs. It's a way to explore basic developmental issues such as sexuality and identity, and it's a way to seek social support like that. It's also a way to engage with the imaginary audience, and this is an old idea put forth by David Elkind, that adolescents go around the world assuming that everyone is watching them all the time. Social media is the imaginary audience come to life. Anything you post can be immediately seen by your hundreds, if not thousands, friends or followers. Marwick and Boyd have pointed out that teens use the affordances of social media to gather attention, to involve themselves in others' lives, and to manipulate public perceptions of who they are. I think the third reason why adolescents are so intensely engaged in digital communication, and maybe why all of us are, is that these devices and the type of communication they deliver to us are powerfully reinforcing, and they operate on an intermittent reinforcement schedule. So this is my iPhone. I call it my iPhone Senior. It's the big one. It's big enough that I can see it. And I love it. And I don't love it because it's pretty or it's cool. I love it because every once in a while when I push the button and check my email or my text messages, something incredibly wonderful comes through. Now, a lot of the time I check and it's nothing. It's work, email, it's chores I have to do, it's junk, it's something I want to ignore. But every once in a while I push that button and it's a text from my college daughter or from my high school daughter, or it's an email that a paper has been accepted. These deliver to us reinforcement on a powerfully reinforcing intermittent schedule, and that's just as true for the adolescents as it is for adults. A lot of research on all forms of digital communication has relied heavily on self-report measures, and this has been pioneering work. But as I said, my training has always been to observe behavior. So what I want to do today is to tell you about our research in which we've used technology to capture the actual content of adolescents' text messaging and social media communication. And I'll focus on text messaging today just because my colleagues are focusing more on social media, but we are capturing social media also. So I want to tell you about the BlackBerry project. And this was the latter part of a longitudinal study that started in 2003 when the students were 9 years old and in the 3rd grade. Members of this ongoing study were provided with BlackBerry smartphones in the summer before they started 9th grade. Fortunately for us, this was in 2008 when BlackBerries were still really cool and iPhones were not required. BlackBerry Enterprise servers allow you to archive or allow services to archive digital communication. We were able to save all of their text messaging, email, and instant messaging to a secure online archive as they moved through grades 9 through 12. And actually, we kept collecting all their digital communication through their 2nd year past high school, so until about age 20. I will say that all students and parents in our study knew that their electronic communication was being captured and coded. There was full consent given every time we saw them. There was no secret about this. We did not limit them to our devices, but we think they used them really heavily because usage of the study-provided BlackBerries was high. We had a mean of 55 text messages sent and 55 received per day. There were absolutely no gender differences in frequency of texting. There was high variation. One male member of our sample regularly sent and received over 19,000 text messages per month for several months. And on average, over 500,000 text messages poured into our archive each month. These rates of usage map very nicely onto what the Pew people find when they do their surveys. So people often wonder, given that the students in your study knew that you were archiving all of their text messaging, were they communicating openly? I believe they were. One way that we looked at this was just to take a 2-day sample of text messaging gathered in the fall of 2009 when they were in the 10th grade. This included 43,505 text messages. We ran it through Luke, which is one of the ways we're coding our data. Luke stands for Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, developed by Jamie Pennebaker at UT Austin. Luke counts the linguistic properties of speech. So in our 2-day sample, we found that about 6.6% of utterances contained sexual themes and 7% contained profane language. And this is comparable to what had been found in unmonitored chat rooms in some earlier research. Much of the communication was positive and neutral, and I'll say more about that in a minute, but some was very frank and profane. If they were monitoring, if they were censoring themselves, I don't know what they would have said otherwise. And I'm not reading this out loud, but you get the idea. Some of it made me want to wash my eyes. So the truth is that most text messaging is positive or neutral. We coded our text messaging data in 2 ways. We did microcoding, very careful line-by-line coding of 2-day samples per year in grades 9 through 12, and we have also developed filters to use Luke to count the linguistic properties of the text messaging. Of course, Luke is dictionary-based, and so we need a filter to fix all the spelling, you can imagine. The truth is, our microcoding reveals that 70% of adolescents' text messages are positive or neutral, and the proportion of their texts that are positive or neutral predicts decreases in internalizing symptoms across the first year of high school. It's also important to say that adolescents use text messaging to engage in intimate, supportive behavior. I am a person who's interested in antisocial behavior and bad behavior, so that's mostly what this talk is going to focus on. But there was plenty of it that was positive. And here's an example of what I think is a really nice text message. The boy says, "You just got some problems, but hey, who doesn't? As long as you have someone you can talk to and tell things to, I promise you things will get a lot better." There are so many people in the world with problems, but they refuse to tell people and open up because honestly, these days, you can't trust anyone. But I'm promising you, I'm here to hear it all, and everything is between us two. Wait, what does your mom do while all this drama between you and your dad is going on? And did your parents send you to live with them, or were you just super close to them growing up? So for all the misspelling, for all the, the informal communication, this is actually a really nice, supportive text message, and we saw a lot of this in our archive. Still, although most of it is positive or neutral, specific negative types of communication seem to predict maladjustment, even if their base rates are low. So what I want to do now is to tell you a couple of brief examples of developmental questions that we've tested using these data. Let me be clear, we have only scratched the surface. We have an enormous amount of data that we're working with. And like I say, this was a longitudinal study, so we saw everybody in person every year, the child, a friend, the parent. We also got teacher data on the child's school, academic and social adjustment at school. So we have a lot of information about these young people's offline lives as well as their online communication. So the first study I'll describe is a study to see whether text messaging about antisocial activities would predict increases in rule-breaking and aggressive behavior across the 9th grade year. So my outstanding former student, Sam Ehrenreich, wanted to know whether adolescents engage in antisocial communication via text messaging. How much do they talk about or text about antisocial behaviors? And he wondered whether texting could be a context for deviant peer communication, deviancy training in the way that Tom DeShawn and his colleagues discuss it. He also wondered whether texting about antisocial behavior would lead to increases in externalizing behaviors. So I'll just give you a short overview of the data collection because it kind of helps you understand the different sources of information that we were working with. The data I'll describe for this study were collected from the spring of the 8th grade year when we got the baseline teacher ratings of externalizing behavior. Then summer vacation, we got participant and parent reports of externalizing behavior. And then over the course of the school year, we coded two-day samples of text messaging, one in the fall around homecoming, which is a special Texas tradition with a big football game and a special dance. It's the social event of the season. And then 2 days around Valentine's Day in the spring. And then we collected at the very end of the school year teacher outcome data from the 9th grade teachers. And then over that same summer, over the following summer vacation, we got parent and participant outcome data. We were measuring externalizing behaviors using the child behavior checklist measures, the parent CBCL, the TRF, the teacher report form of the CBCL, and the youth self-report form. So that's kind of the overview. Like I said, we microcoded 4 days of SMS communication, and our coding system was designed primarily to capture social aggression as well as other key forms of communication, but we carefully coded antisocial behaviors as well. And these are the ones we examined: property crimes, physical aggression, substance use, and rule breaking. It was not difficult to code these types of text messages reliably. So the results showed that first of all, adolescents did communicate about antisocial behaviors in text messaging. You can see here that about 59% of our adolescents engaged in some type of antisocial text messaging. And of those who did, their mean number of antisocial texts over 4 days was 7. You can see the percentages for the type of antisocial texting. But what we take from this is that text messaging about antisocial behavior does occur. To give you a flavor of what these communications are like, here is an example. Just go through this. I apologize for the size of this type. I will read this. So this is Michelle talking to Griffin, and the only thing we've changed here is names and a few details to de-identify it. So Michelle says to Griffin, "Have you seen the Pixar movie Ratatouille while flying high? You need to." And Griffin says to Michelle, "I should, but I don't feel like flying high right now. I'm waiting until the mall tonight." And Michelle says to Griffin, "Wow, dude, how many wings," which means how much marijuana, "do you have? It's like a freaking endless supply." And Griffin says to Michelle, "LOL, I have bought $85 of weed in all my weed life. It lasted a long time, still lasting." Michelle says to Griffin, "Dang, son." Griffin says to Michelle, "I didn't buy it all at once. And I use a pipe which conserves weed. It's amazing what pipes can do." Michelle says to Griffin, "Yeah, I see that now." And he says, "Yeah, I always get my stuff from my guy in town. He gets me lots for cheap. It's like $20 for 5 grams. Michelle says to Griffin, "Ha, you've got the connections." And Griffin says, "Yeah, I only buy from Nick. That is A1 stuff. That's the best stuff ever." And Michelle says to Griffin, "Oh, yeah, well, I don't want to get hooked." And Griffin says to Michelle, "LOL, don't. It's expensive. But yeah, don't buy from Nick. It's too expensive, and it would ruin other types of weed because they won't get you as high as A1. So what you see in this example is deviancy training at its finest. You see encouragement and establishing the behavior as normative. Hey, have you seen the movie Ratatouille while flying high, like as one does? And ha, you've got all the connections. You see instruction. And I use a pipe which conserves weed. He's teaching her. You got to get the special pipe. It'll save you money. My guy gets me lots for cheap, like 20 for 5 grams, and so on. So what we wanted to see was whether this type of antisocial text messaging would predict higher rates of involvement in antisocial behavior prior to entering the 10th grade. So these results are regression models that include gender, baseline rule breaking. So this is rule breaking at the start of the 9th grade year. Total utterances is just the frequency of text messaging. We wanted to know that the antisocial content of text messaging predicted increases in antisocial behavior above and beyond frequency. So total utterances is just frequency. And then last, antisocial utterances, number of text messages or percentage of text messages that were antisocial. And what you can see is that antisocial text message utterances predicted increases in rule-breaking behavior across the 9th grade year, according to self-report, teacher report, and parent report. Similar results were found for aggressive behavior, except that the results weren't significant for parent report. But for self-report and teacher report, text messaging about antisocial behavior predicted increases in aggression according to self-report and teacher report, above and beyond gender, above and beyond baseline aggressive behavior, and above and beyond simple text message frequency. So we think what this shows is that adolescents use text messaging as a forum for antisocial communication, and that antisocial talk via SMS significantly predicts later involvement in rule-breaking and aggressive behavior. Text messaging really is a meaningful venue for social interaction and can be a significant predictor of later behavior. We dismiss this form of communication at our own risk. We also think a lot of the content of our archive suggests that parents and school administrators need to redouble their efforts to monitor SMS in school. There is a lot of texting in school, and a lot of it is about where to meet, in what bathroom, to smoke what kinds of substances. I want to tell you about another example where we looked at a particular form of text messaging, one that again has a fairly low base rate but is predictive of psychopathology. This study is called Let's Talk About Sex, Sexting, Early Sexual Activity, and Borderline Personality Features in Adolescence. The purpose of this study was to move beyond sexting in the context of sexually explicit pictures and to identify the prevalence of sexting defined as sending written messages with sexual content. The technology we use does allow us to capture the pictures. We have the pictures, we never open them up. We never plan to look at them. Don't want to, never will. There was a lot of writing about sex in the text messages, and that's how we define sexting for the purpose of this study. We wanted to see whether text messaging about sex related to increased sexual activity, and we also wanted to see whether text messaging about sex would predict borderline personality features above and beyond sexual activity. Other goals were to identify the prevalence of sexting in a typically developing sample, and to, like I say, to define it not as sending pictures, but as written messages. And so here's an example of a sexting conversation in which adolescents are discussing what sexting is. So Harry says to Sally, "Awkward question, have you ever sexted before?" And Harry says to Sally, "What does that even mean?" And she says, "You don't understand what sexting is?" And he says, "Not really." She says, "Oh, it's like describing what you would do to the other person during sex." And then Harry says to Sally, "Oh, so, I don't know what to say now." And then Harry says to Sally, "Oh, I thought it was like sending pics or something, but I wasn't sure. Have you ever done it before?" Now, I could show you lots of profane sexting exchanges, and I'm not going to do that. But what I like is they're actually talking about what it means. They're not sure. And the girl is saying, "Oh, no, it's not just about pictures. You, like, write stuff about what you would do." And we saw a lot of that in our archive. So the method for this study is pretty similar to the one I showed you before, except we were looking across the 10th grade year, predicting to 12th grade. So we measured borderline personality features using the McLean screening measure for borderline personality. That was given prior to entering the 10th grade and then again following the 12th grade year. So that's ages approximately 16 and 18. Then we used a combination of questionnaires to assess risky sexual activity, adapted from some existing surveys. And then across the 10th grade year, we coded two two-day transcripts for discussions of sexual behavior. Due to like I say, we coded these two-day samples for both discussions of hypothetical and actual behavior. So let me show you just some descriptive statistics. First of all, you can see that about 65% of our sample was involved in text messaging with sexual content. The rates of texting about hypothetical sexual activity were higher than the rates of texting about actual sexual activity. Some of the texting about actual sexual activity seemed like a lot of talk. It seemed like they couldn't possibly be doing what they said they were doing while they were texting. But anyway, actual and hypothetical talk about texting about sex were highly correlated. So about 118 of our participants center received a total of about 3,594 sex talk utterances. Boys were more likely to send texts about actual sexual behavior. There were no differences in texting about hypothetical sexual behavior. Just for the sake of time, I will say that our first set of hypotheses about sexting predicting sexual activity were all supported. It was absolutely the case that text messaging about sex raised the likelihood of an early sexual debut of various types of risky sex. Just as one example of one of these findings, adolescents who engaged in sex talk and texting were 1.43 times more likely to have had sex by age 18. Texting about sex at age 16 predicted the likelihood of an early sexual debut and, like I say, other forms of risky sex behavior. We also thought it would be interesting to see whether engaging in sex talk and text messaging would be positively related to borderline personality features at age 18 and would predict growth in those features from age 16 to 18. Borderline personality disorder is a DSM-5 diagnosis that's characterized by a lot of instability, impulsive behavior, unstable, chaotic interpersonal relationships, and desperate attempts to avoid abandonment, among other symptoms. We believe that text messaging might be one context in which adolescents, perhaps at risk for borderline personality disorder, might express their desperate need for attention and for connectedness. So again, just going quickly for the sake of time, this is just an example of one of our findings. What we wanted to know was whether text messaging about sex predicted increases in borderline features above and beyond baseline borderline features, above and beyond gender, and above and beyond our sexual risk variables. Since we know sexting predicts to sexual activity, we wanted to know, even above and beyond the risky sex behaviors, was text messaging about sex predicting borderline personality features at age 18? And the answer is it was. And for every model we tested with every different type of risky sex included, sex talk, texting about sex in grade 10 predicted increases in borderline personality features. And there were no gender differences in these findings. We believe that this suggests that the constant availability of text messaging might be problematic for some adolescents, that sexting might facilitate the impulsive, sensation-seeking features of borderline personality, and that, in addition, sexting might create added pressure to engage in sexual activity because the expectation has been set. I worry that there's something about sexting that may exacerbate borderline personality features. We've only started to examine how text messaging relates to qualities of relationships, and this is just a very, a very quick look at this. We looked at the correlations between some of our texting variables and qualities of friendship, self-reported qualities of friendship on a friendship qualities measure in the 9th grade. And the very sad side of the story is that there was no relation between anything about texting and any of the positive features. But you can see that there were relations between text messaging variables and negative features of friendship. And that's worrisome. We want to understand a lot more about what qualities of text messaging predict what qualities of relationships. And that means that we need to code our data in a new way, I believe, and to look at some variables we haven't looked at yet. We are examining social media. A lot of this has been covered already. I will just say that right now I'm doing a study in collaboration with the Anderson Cooper 360 program and Bob Ferris at UC Davis, where we're looking at the social media communication of 13-year-olds, and 13-year-olds love Twitter. It's the preferred platform. 76% of them, Instagram, love Instagram. And the thing we have to remember about social media is that they're not just posting, but they're reading these enormous feeds of all of their friends and followers. And so they're exposed to all kinds of things on those feeds all the time. So what I believe is that adolescents use social media and text messaging to meet their developmental needs. And basic developmental theories can be texted in this context. We need to understand much more about how digital communication affects the quality of adolescents' relationships. In the words of Dana Boyd, adolescents are not addicted to social media. If anything, they are addicted to each other. Adolescents are living their social lives online, and we need to move toward understanding digital communication not as a distraction from their real relationships, but as a significant part of their social worlds. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to share some of this work with you. I'm at the School of Information at the University of Michigan. iSchools, for those of you who aren't familiar with them, come out of the library tradition. So they're kind of like librarians discover the internet. My training was in communication theory and research. So what I'm really interested in is how these new online tools kind of reshape our interactions with one another and the extent to which we get value from these relationships. So today what I'd like to do is share some thoughts about the definitional properties of social network sites and how they can support social relationships and our ability to extract value and give back to those in our social network. So the overall argument that I'll be making is that the social network sites in particular have social and technical affordances that help individuals invest in and maintain and extract value from their social networks. So obviously there's a whole slew of social media applications. Most of the research that I've done focuses specifically on Facebook. Facebook is a social network site, which is slightly different from some of the other apps that you see represented up here. What Facebook, I think other people have talked about this as well, it has about 1.4 billion monthly active users, and more than 80% of those are outside North America. So, and I think Patty actually set some of this up very nicely, this distinction between traditional mass communication and social media, and so thinking about what are the differences. This is a page from the first American newspaper. So newspapers are broadcast forms of communication, mass comm, one-to-many, right? And interestingly enough, early newspapers actually had more interactive features. So as I said, this is the first newspaper in the US, printed in 1690. And it was a 4-page newspaper, but actually only 3 pages had print on them. The 4th was left blank so that users could write thoughts and opinions on it before they gave it to the next person. But one of the things, and of course now many newspapers in the print tradition don't have those forms of interaction, nor do mass media like radio or television. One of the things that you might have worried about if you were living around this time was the plague. And here's a recent story that I first encountered on Facebook about the plague being actually distributed by gerbils, not rats. I'm not alone in getting some of my news from Facebook. In 2013, Pew did a study that suggests that 30% of all US adults, not just online adults, all US adults get news on Facebook, and 22% think of Facebook as a good place to get news. And this is just one example of the interesting ways in which our distinctions between newer and older forms of media are collapsing, and our communication and consumption patterns are really being reshaped, right? So in the case of Facebook and news, one of the things that I know when one of my friends points to something is that I might be more interested in it, right? That they've kind of done some of the curation work and directing my attention to those particular stories. And in the case of this gerbil Black Plague story, this might have been something that I would have missed if it were not for Facebook. So this example of exposure to novel information is one of the benefits we get from our social ties. Other benefits we get from our networks include social and emotional support. So what properties define a social network site? In 2007, I worked with Dana Boyd to curate one of the first academic studies of, collections of social network sites. This was published in the Journal of Computer Mediated Communication. And as part of editing this special issue, we wrote an overview of the academic literature on social network sites, which was not much at the time. And we also decided to forward a definition of social network sites, because one of the things that was happening was that people were using these terms, social network site or social networking site, to mean a whole host of things, not using the same term to mean different things, different terms to mean the same thing. And it was really kind of stymieing our ability as researchers to synthesize across fields, which I think is especially important for work in this area. So the three things that we talked about in 2007 as being definitional components of social network sites were a profile, an articulated list of connections, so in Facebook that would be the friends list, and then the ability to traverse through those connections. Obviously a lot has changed since 2007 in terms of both the social practices and the technologies themselves. So last year in a chapter, we revisited our definition to kind of take into account some of the things that had been changed since 2007. And you'll see that the profile is still here and still very prominent. Only one difference is that now instead of profiles being more static with just kind of user-supplied content, oftentimes profiles now in social media are co-created. So my friends post to my wall. My friends tag pictures of myself. There's also server-supplied information, so things I'm doing on the site. And this is in distinction to kind of earlier, more static forms. And then the other major difference is that we're really calling out the importance of the stream, right? In Facebook, this is the news feed, this kind of aggregated collection of everything that our contacts on the site are producing. So I wanted to use these three properties to kind of frame my talk, which will focus on each of those. So the first one I want to talk about is the profile. I think this is user profiles are a fascinating context to study questions of identity, right? How we think about ourselves. And when you look at the really, really early work on profiles, so I'm thinking of, for instance, Sherry Turkle's work on MUDs in the 1990s, there was a lot of talk about them being these kind of fantastical places to explore different components of our identity. So you could go online and pretend to be a different gender, or pretend to interact with people in a online context where everyone was pretending to be an animal, for instance. And, of course, different online contexts have very different understandings and expectations about how much people will kind of play with fantasy. And in many of the spaces that we look at now, there's not really this kind of sense that what happens online is so different from what happens online, right? There's much more of a sense that online representations are meant to connect with our offline identity in some way. So thinking about, again, profiles in 2007, as I said, very static. This is mostly information that I've created. And more recently, with Facebook at least, we see many other kinds of identity information. So information supplied by the server itself or by my friends on the site. So I've done a little bit of work looking at self-presentation in online dating contexts, and I think it's a particularly interesting context because you have the same affordances that allow you to basically engage in deception or in kind of fantastical presentations of identity, but then you also have this expectation that you're going to meet face-to-face, right, at some point. And so you want to use the affordances of the site to put your best foot forward, but you can't lie in such a way that when you meet someone for coffee, they are, they get up and storm off because you look nothing like your photo, right? So thinking about identity kind of more globally, René Descartes struggled for months, right, thinking about identity and, who am I? And this question is pretty routinely posed to anyone who wants to create a profile on an online dating site. So a few years ago, I did some research with colleagues, and what we did was we looked at profile-based self-presentation. So we collected the profiles of Match.com and other online dating site users, and then we asked them to come into the lab. And when they came into the lab, we asked them to get on a scale and to show us their driver's license so that we could see their age, and then we compared the two. What we found was that most people lied on one of those three dimensions, height, weight, or age, but the magnitude of the deceptions was very, very small, something that you might not even really notice if you met the person face to face. We also interviewed our participants, and really what we were curious about is their thoughts about what the profile represented, and also what kinds of discrepancies, online and offline discrepancies, they felt were acceptable, okay? And so to come up with kind of a conceptual framework for how people think about the profile in this particular setting. And what we found was that the asynchronous nature of profile creation and consumption allowed people to basically select from a library of selves when they created their profile. So the fact that I was writing a profile today, but I don't really know when it will be read. Maybe it's not going to be read for 6 months. Maybe in 6 months I'll lose 10 pounds. Therefore, for me to list my weight as 10 pounds lighter, it's not really a lie. So this was kind of the way that people understood these profiles and what they represented. So when it came to the acceptability of which of these discrepancies was problematic, if the trait was something you could change, right? So it's okay to fib a bit about your weight. It's not okay to fib about whether you have children, right? One of those things can be changed. And also the magnitude. So if it was a very, very big difference, this was much more problematic than smaller ones. So here, I'm not going to go too much into this data collection, but I did want to give you just a couple of quotes. So this is someone who's talking about their profile and and what's acceptable and what's not. And she's basically saying that if you have the intention of becoming that person, it's not as problematic. So in this case, she's saying, I don't go to the gym now, but if I had a job where I had money and I could pay for my gym membership, I would. Therefore, it's okay for me to list that on my profile. We also found people incorporating aspects of their past selves. So here was someone who created the profile when they weren't smoking, started smoking, but then didn't go back to correct it because they wanted to stop. They just haven't, I haven't stopped yet. And so the conceptual framework that we suggest was that people weren't thinking about their profile as an exact one-to-one replication of who they were offline at that moment, but rather it was a promise to this imagined audience of who they might be by the time they met face to face. Okay. So this was profile, and that was online dating. I want to talk more specifically about social network sites, which is actually more of the work that I've done recently. So thinking about this articulated network of friends, right, that we have. What are some of the ways in which we interact with these people? And I'll note that this is slightly different from the other forms of social media. So for instance, on a blog, I can have a list of other blogs that I attend to, but those people aren't necessarily connecting back to me. So one of the definitional characteristic here is that the visual nature is both ways. So on Twitter, for instance, I can see who follows me, but also who I follow. Okay. And so we have these friends. They're also called contacts, connections, followers. And these connections really serve multiple purposes on a social network site. So they can mark relationships. They can delineate who can access what content, right? And they also serve as a network through which users can browse profiles and discover friends in common. Okay. Now there's much more emphasis on the social graph, right, as opposed to just kind of the ego-centered friends network. So the social graph is the entire collection of all networks on a particular site. And media companies in particular are very interesting in leveraging the information embedded in social graphs. So the idea is that if I'm friends with 15 people, it may be that what those 15 people are interested in is also going to be interesting to me, right? And so as these sites develop these algorithms for what they think we're interested in, they're really relying on and trying to leverage information in the social graph. The key theoretical framework that my colleagues and I have used to understand some of these social exchanges are social capital. So this generally refers to the benefits we get from our social relationships. This is an example of a barn raising. This could be considered a form of social capital. Okay, it's established an established theoretical perspective in the sociological literature, although now many other disciplines are using it. And so in the sociological literature, you would look at your position in a network, the size of your network, right? And what are the resources possessed by those in your network? And this helps us understand kind of how these resources can be deployed and activated via social relationships. One important component of social capital is reciprocity. Okay, this notion that if I help someone, I'm going to expect that they will help me in the future. And Nan Lin, who does work in this area, actually just defines social capital as an investment in social relations with expected returns in the marketplace. Two forms of social capital. Most of the work that I've done focuses on bridging social capital, and this is, we know this primarily as the strength of weak ties. So the idea here is that we are, due to homophily pressures, we're usually share a lot of characteristics with those that we're close to, and we're more likely to access new worldviews and novel information from our weaker ties, our friends of friends. In early work, in 2007, using an undergraduate population, we discovered that self-reported use of Facebook was predictive of social capital, bonding and bridging social capital. And we think about why this might be. There's a few things that we would point to. So one is that through the status update, you can broadcast requests, right? You can ask for social support, you can ask for information, and it's very easy then for one's networks to answer, right? To comment on these requests. Social network sites also facilitate exposure to friends of friends, which we know are more likely to provide this novel information, and they also allow people to engage in relationship maintenance and social grooming. Okay, what do I mean by social grooming? So think about primates and grooming, right? This is literally the picking of nits off of one another. This in primates, this helps develop bonds within groups, and also creates the expectation that it will be, this attention will be reciprocated. Okay, as humans, we don't engage in this kind of grooming so very often, but we do engage in social grooming. So the idea here is that when you go to write happy birthday on a friend's page in Facebook, you are communicating to that person, I care about you, right? I'm paying attention to you, okay? And you can, so when we like a picture, right, this is a way to indicate attention, okay? And so one of the things that we've done in this study in JCMC that was published last year is we use survey data from about 600 non-faculty staff at a university in the United States, and we introduce a scale that we call Facebook Relationship Maintenance Behaviors. And so these are questions that people would either agree or disagree with, and you can see that items are things like, when I see a friend or acquaintance asking a question on Facebook that I know the answer to, I try to respond. Okay, so this is the idea. When you see a need expressed by someone on Facebook, do you try to help out? And when we do a regression predicting bridging social capital, you can see that these social grooming behaviors, so people who report that they try to act when they see a request from their networks, that this is very predictive of social capital. Okay, and why might this be? Well, I think a few things are going on. So one is this expectation about reciprocal behavior, right? If you're more likely to answer questions from your friends on Facebook, you may have more of an expectation that they'll help you out, right, when you ask for help. There's also this social grooming function and signaling attention to certain ties within the group. At least in Facebook, the newsfeed algorithm tends to privilege information from people that you have past exchanges with, and so interacting with someone then may help you become more visible to one another within the newsfeed itself. And then finally, comments on friends' updates and wall posts are seen by the friends network, not your own. So think about the strength of weak ties. When I write a status update, it's just going out to people that I already know. When I comment on someone else's status update, it's going out to their network. And therefore, I'm connecting to these friends of friends. So why is it important to actually do something, right? To click, to write a comment? And you can think about the constraints of the system. So basically, if you don't take some action and leave a visible trace, there's no way for someone to know whether you saw that post or not. So clicking in Facebook serves the same function in some ways as the whites of our eyes in face-to-face interaction, where we would make eye contact with someone, or you could see where someone was looking, right? So humans have several times larger. The whites of their eyes are several times larger than other primates, and really this evolved because it allows for coordination, right? You can see where someone's looking, you can, figure out what they may do, and the idea here is that in these mediated contexts, we don't have eye gaze to indicate attention, and therefore we need to take some visible action that kind of serves that same purpose. Okay, and last but not least, I want to talk about the stream, right? So in Facebook, essentially you have a status update that you can send out and broadcast to those in your network, and then all of those updates are aggregated in a media stream. In Twitter, it's the front page, right? This is this kind of collection of content from your network, and and we know now that most people spend a lot of time in the stream itself. They're not really clicking from profile to profile the way you were in earlier versions of social network sites. And so one of the things that we've decided to do in this more recent work is to really focus in on the instance where people are asking for help from their network as a kind of a really explicit window in which we can study some of these social capital dynamics, as opposed to asking kind of general self-report measures of, how, what are your behaviors online. So here you can see that social network sites enable question asking and information sharing. This is something I posted from a few years ago when I was in Boston on sabbatical, asking my network, what should I do with the kids before we leave Boston? And got a bunch of answers, some more useful than others. You can also ask for social requests, social support. So here's a post from someone in my network who's talking about their beloved kitty who just died, and you can see that they're getting a stream of people expressing sympathy. So as I said, we're focusing on this recent work on how people are using this particular status update field to ask for help and to get provisions of help. All of these papers, I should say, are online, so I'm not going to go into specific details, but generally what we did, and this was with collaboration with Facebook researchers, is we hand-coded a corpus of public status updates to look at what kinds of requests people were making of one another. So for instance, was it asking for recommendation? Was it asking for a favor? Was it asking for informational help? So the first thing we did was looked at whether it was asking for help or not. We called these resource mobilization requests. And if they were asking for help, what kind of help were they asking for? And also, what was the cost of that request? Was it something that could just be done online through a click, through sharing something? Or was it something that needed offline help, like help me move on Saturday? Okay. And what we found was that the 4% of all public status updates were these mobilization requests. Most of them were favor requests and polls or asking for information. And most of these, 70%, were very low cost. So something that could be done just within that online setting. In another paper in 2014, we looked at responses to those public mobilization requests. So what was the comment stream like? And when we compared mobilization requests, where people were asking for a response, to those where people weren't asking for a response, what we found was that mobilization requests received more comments, and they also received those comments faster. So suggesting that the audience did, or the network did, try to respond when they saw people asking for some kind of support. And so, of course, then what's the link to social capital? So in the third piece, published in New Media and Society last year, we use the public hand-coded status updates to train a classifier, a computer program, that we then were able to use to analyze private status updates as either being likely to be mobilizations or not. Okay, and we were also able to invite users to participate in a survey. And what we do when we compare our self-reported social capital measures to these mobilization attempts in these status updates, we found that those who posted one or more mobilization attempts in this 28-day period reported higher bridging and bonding social capital than those who didn't post one. We also show that our social grooming measures were positive, significant predictors of both bridging social capital, which is this exposure to information from our weak ties, and also bonding social capital, which speaks more to emotional support and is often associated with closer ties like friends and family. Okay? And then finally, we found that 28% of the active users on the site posted one or more mobilization attempt in that period. So it is more common than our earlier work suggested. So in conclusion, social network sites include a set of affordances that allow people to maintain these social relationships and also to help people extract value from their connections. I believe strongly that the connections we feel and the benefits we access via social media are just as authentic and important as those sustained through face-to-face communication. And I think we should stop talking about offline interaction as being the real world and online interaction as being something ersatz or fake. E-relationships are relationships. Thank you.
Thank you, Marian. Thank you to the visionaries at APS for having the foresight, I think, to put on an international conference. Thanks to everybody who exerted so much effort. Today I'll talk about, or try to answer this question, can technology bring us true love? And I want to begin by observing that having a romantic relationship tends to be linked to all sorts of good physical and psychological health outcomes, but the quality of your relationship matters a tremendous amount. So not all relationships are going to have those positive effects. When we are involved with somebody who's compatible with us, that is when things are particularly good. The problem is that it's not always simple to meet somebody who's compatible with you. And for this reason, in all cultures that we know of, there is some type of matchmaking process. There's been wide cultural variation in how matchmaking works, but never until this century have we seen anything like how matchmaking predominantly works today, which is through computers and intensive mathematical matchmaking algorithms. eHarmony is the prototype here. As I'll talk more about it, they try to set you up with somebody who's similar to you. And what I want to talk about today is the issues with the existing matchmaking algorithms, and I want to try to set up a vision for what an effective matchmaking algorithm might look like, right? I think nobody's built one yet. I certainly am not going to suggest that I have one, but I want to push us in the direction that I think actually holds some promise. Excuse me. Before I do that, we need to ask this question: what is compatibility? And one of the reasons why this question is so important to me is that Google, the big tech company, held what they call a roundtable. They invited me out and a bunch of leaders of the major online dating sites, but also human matchmakers like old school style matchmakers. And the conversation in the room frequently revolved around men who are threes really thinking that they deserve women who are nines. And oh, you like that? Yeah. So I determined, so I actually made a fuss and I think became unpopular because I think if the matchmakers of the world think that way, the world is worse. Because we don't want to figure out who are the nines and who are the sevens and who are the fours and set them up so that they're not with anybody who's better or worse than they are. We want something more sophisticated, right? So imagine that here's Dave, right? It is possible that there's these other women in the world. We're going to talk about the heterosexual case in this particular talk. But what we want to figure out is cases where we can find somebody who's uniquely compatible with Dave, right? Not that like he got the best woman in the pool and then the next best guy got the next best gal in the pool, right? We want to find unique levels of compatibility. And of course, that is what all the matchmaking algorithms are attempting to do. So how have existing matchmaking algorithms, including eHarmony and basically everything that exists today, how are they going about building matchmaking algorithms, and why are my co-authors and I so skeptical about this? Well, it turns out that we can think of two different types of data that you can incorporate into a matchmaking algorithm. The first type is individualistic data, any information that you can collect on individuals. So the typical sorts of information include things like demographics and age and personality and attitudes and values. I kid you not to say that there are sites that are trying to match people based on DNA. Right? You can submit your cheek swab and they will match you up with somebody who's compatible with you based on your genetics. And if you believe that, God bless. This is the information that is available to all of the existing matchmaking sites. Now, is it adequate? Well, a whole bunch of us, in fact, I'll list the names. So a team of relationships researchers, Harry Reese, myself, Benjamin Carney, Sue Sprecher, and Paul Eastwick worked very hard trying to figure out what's up with online dating in general, but one of the major things we did is we tried to figure out, has anybody built a matchmaking algorithm that actually works? I did not start out skeptical about this question, but what happened is with, I don't know how many years, 50, 100 years of relationship science expertise in that group, we asked ourselves the question, could we do it? Could we take information about personality, information about values or DNA or anything else like that, and build an effective matchmaking algorithm? Not find the people who are good in relationships and the people who are bad in relationships. You can assess things like neuroticism, and that'll give you some predictive value, but the unique compatibility, the sort of thing I was showing you on the previous slide. And we decided that we ourselves cannot do it. And we know what the principles are that the matchmaking algorithms use, because they're very limited in terms of what information is available to them. If you have information about a whole bunch of men and information about a whole bunch of women, but of course the men have no idea that these particular women exist and vice versa, you have individual level information. What can you do? You can set people up who are similar, you can set people who are up who are dissimilar, but the range of options you have for compatibility is actually relatively narrow. So the question is this. Our intro to psych textbooks, our intro to social psych textbooks, our relationship textbooks all tell us that similarity leads to attraction. Are they right? They are wrong. So here's what we know about similarity and attraction. Number one, homogamy is real. People end up with other people who are similar to them. Is that sufficient to conclude that they like people who are similar to them? It is not, because you meet people who tend to be similar to you in all sorts of demographic, attitudinal sorts of ways. Second, perceived similarity, the sorts, for those of you up on this literature, the sorts of paradigms that Don Byrne innovated in the early 60s, perceived similarity, the belief that you have things in common with a person, huge predictor of romantic attraction. Those pieces of information are of no value whatsoever if you're trying to build a matchmaking algorithm. How can I report my perceived similarity about all of the hypothetical women who might be in the pool? I don't know how similar I am to hypothetical entities that I don't know exist. What they need to focus on is actual similarity, and it turns out that now we know a great deal that we didn't know even 5 years ago. Turns out that if you look at actual similarity, you get almost no traction whatsoever in terms of initial attraction. So my colleagues and I ran a set of speed dating events, for example, and we looked at subjective similarity. If you think you're similar to the person you just met speed dating, you're way more attracted to that person. But we had the big five. We had a whole bunch of values measures, social sexual orientation. We had a whole series of different individual level pieces of information. It collectively predicts no variance in how attracted you are to people. Similarly, a team of scholars has done a 23,000 person, 3-nation nationally representative sample looking at the big five and marital satisfaction, and you get 0.5%. 0.5% of the variation in relationship satisfaction is due to similarity in personality. Basically, you're not getting much traction with this stuff at all. There is a second type of data that in principle we can use, and in practice nobody's ever figured out how to use. This is couple level data. You don't want to know whether you have some similar quality to another person in the abstract. What you want to know is when you got across from a pint of beer or a cup of coffee together, did the conversation sizzle, right? Did you feel like, whoa, I want to know this person better, right? That's dyadic level information. You can't get that from personality questionnaires or from cheek swabs. You want to know about rapport. You want to know about the sizzle of the conversation, whether you laugh at the same jokes at the same time, whether you have this type of connection. The problem is, to this point, the individual level data don't work. The problem is it even possible to incorporate dyadic information? What would it even mean? What does it even look like to try to build a matchmaking algorithm that takes account of information that is actually assessed at the couple level or the dyadic level? Now, what I'll do with this talk, I have 3 different parts. The first part, I want to talk about some scientific developments within social psychology that I think hold the kernel, this basic set of, this way of thinking about compatibility that I think we might be able to leverage to build an effective matchmaking algorithm. Next, after I talk about the science, I want to talk about new technological developments, particularly in the domain of machine learning, that I think we can use in concert with the science to develop such an algorithm. And then finally, I'll get very concrete with an example of what I think an implementation of this set of ideas might look like. So, the science is built on one idea. The idea basically is interdependence, right? If 2 people don't know each other, then knowing any information about Dave tells you nothing about Alice, right? Knowing that Dave is happy or sad or his heart's beating fast or beating slow tells you nothing about Alice. But as we become more attracted, as we even early on begin to develop some type of connection together, you start to get interdependence. You start to get just a teeny bit of information that if you know that information about Dave, you actually start to have a little bit of information about Alice. There starts to be a real connection, and it is correlated with the extent to which the 2 of them are connected. So, the logic behind this matchmaking algorithm idea comes from basically 2 sets of findings from the psychology literature. I'm going to breeze through this stuff relatively quickly, but one of the findings is that if you have initial chemistry, particularly if you want this other person to like you, you tend to engage in various forms of non-conscious synchrony. This can be behavioral mimicry, it can be the prosody of your speech, it can be the way you're using language, but across a whole bunch of experimental studies that manipulate the extent to which you would like this person to like you, what you see is the greater amount of desire for the person to like you, the more you non-consciously tend to mimic that person's various qualities, behaviors, vocal style, etc. Now, independent line of research starts the other way. It says, what if people mimicked you? What if you were like non-consciously mimicked, like you were interacting with a Confederate who was trained to mimic your body posture, mimic your facial movements, etc. Would you like that person more? And the answer to that is yes as well. These are 2 independent streams of research, but I want to suggest that they connect up in an interesting way. And in particular, what I want to suggest is that if 2 people like each other, they will surely know that there's some connection there, but there is some amount of the connection that is not accessible to their self-reports, but that is accessible to their nonverbals, right? That's the whole point behind non-conscious synchrony. And if we can tap that non-conscious synchrony, if we can figure out a way to use technology to tap non-conscious synchrony in real time, then we might be able to get a sense above and beyond their subjective experiences of how attracted they are to each other, and maybe leverage that information, again, above and beyond subjective experience, to predict longitudinal or at least short-term and perhaps longer-term compatibility. Let me talk a little bit about the science. I'm just going to give suggestive evidence for some of these ideas. This is some research I've done in collaboration with a team of people, including Molly Ireland, on language style matching. This is a 2011 Psych Science paper. So, language style matching, let me back up. Language style matching is the way we structure our sentences, basically, not the content of what we're talking about. It's not like we like people who tend to like soccer or tend to like tofu burgers, right? It's not what you're talking about. It's the way you use language. They're called function words, and they are meaningless out of context. Thee, me, right? There's a whole range of words that stitch together all the content words. So is the way we use these seemingly meaningless words linked to the amount of attraction we feel to each other? So this is a first study. This is a study that we ran at Northwestern University. Let's imagine Dave again. The way speed dating works, I'm sure most of you know this already. At our events, we had 12 men and 12 women. These were heterosexual speed dating events. So Dave would go on a date with the first woman, and then I was the MC of these events. I would blow the whistle. Dave would rotate, or Alice would rotate or something, and basically it was the case that every male met all of the females and every female met all of the males, right? So when we ran this study, we looked at matchmaking. Now, specifically, what we did is we transcribed and then coded through LIWC, the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count, the extent of language style matching. Now, let me tell you, I would not be able to tell. Like if I were to read high language style matched pairs and low language style matched pairs, even after doing this research, I couldn't tell you which was which. But the software knows. This stuff is very subtle. And what you can do is you can look, these are, I think these are, I forget if this is median splits or standard deviation above and below the mean. You get the same story regardless. But you want to look at percentage matching. Speed dating has this terrific quality, which is at the end of the 4-minute speed date, actually they did it that night, you indicate, with regard to each person you met, do you want to see that person again? There is a very good, very objective measure of yes, there is at least some spark here. She has to say yes to him, he has to say yes to her. So what happens? Well, if you have the low language style matching pair, you got about 9% of the dyads matching. If you had high language style matching pairs, you got about 33% of the dyads matching. These effects control above and beyond how much you reported liking each other, how much you reported being similar to each other. This is tapping unique variants above and beyond what you've got going on in your head. Now, you might say, okay, that's 4 minutes. Who cares? Right? Now, I actually think that 4 minutes is like, if you can predict initial attraction, you're already got a good head start on an algorithm. But this second study, we studied the instant messaging logs of dating couples who had been dating on average 16 months at the time that they submitted their 10-day instant messaging logs. And we followed them to see who broke up over the next several months. Turns out that if you are low in language style matching, you had about a 54% chance of still being together. If you were high in language style matching, you had about a 78% chance of still being together. These effects exist above and beyond any effects of self-reported satisfaction at baseline and like a litany of plausible alternative explanations. Now, let me back up here. This is suggestive. I'm not trying to be comprehensive here, but I'm just illustrating what I mean when I talk about this idea that you can actually tap some sort of information with technology that seems to be predictive of compatibility above and beyond people's ability to tap that stuff on their own. There's a whole bunch of different research on body posture and so forth. I'm going to fast forward and talk about the technology. Now, I don't know much about machine learning. Some people in the room are probably knowledgeable about machine learning, but I studied up on it a little bit. Turns out one of the more basic forms of machine learning is Siri. Apple's digital personal assistant, and Google's got one, right? Basically, you say, Siri, where is the conference site, right? And Siri says, go this way, go that way. What Siri starts to do, and over time the technology's been getting better, is it really starts to understand speech in real time. Can Siri do this perfectly? No. But the rate of progress with regard to voice recognition technology is staggering. If Siri works nearly perfectly, so to the degree that within a year or 2 years or 3 years, it works nearly perfectly, what can we do? We can listen to a conversation with two people conversing, say, through the internet, listen to it in real time, and have the text spit out. And I showed you on the previous slide that once you have that text, you run it through software, and it can tell you language style matching. And I also told you that language style matching seems to be pretty strongly linked to initial romantic compatibility and relationship longevity, right? But Siri is not really what I think, or this language or text stuff is, I don't think, the most exciting way to go. There's other ways to go. So this is some research by, I'm not going to get the pronunciation right, Sichuan Du at Ohio State University, a computer science person. And what she's interested in is face recognition. Literally this field called computer vision. So what she's done is she's identified 94 facial landmarks. And what the computer can now do, right, like assuming that you have a camera on your computer, and frankly these days, who doesn't, the computer can start to tell. The computer can distinguish happy from surprised. The computer actually, starting recently, can distinguish those two from happily surprised. The computer can also distinguish happy from disgusted, and seriously, this is the greatest thing that can ever happen to you if somebody looks at you with happy disgust. Right? This is like you told a lewd joke and she kind of liked it anyway, you're in, right? So the computer can detect these sorts of pieces of information. Now, these pieces of information are useful in their own right, right? So if you can get people's, what Paul Ekman has called micro expressions, right? People leak some amount of their affective experiences on their face without realizing that they're doing it. So you can use this information in a pretty basic way of trying to discern above and beyond their sort of self-presentation or attempted self-presentation, what sort of emotional experiences are they having. But more importantly, you can look at the extent to which the two individuals talking are altering their emotional experiences at the same time. So what is the latency? How immediately am I switching from neutral to smiley, right? And is that around the same thing? And when I tell a joke and give a smile and you respond with happy disgust, right? We can start to use these dyadic cues to get that sort of information about compatibility. Now, last one that I'll show you in terms of just illustrating the sorts of technology, this is Bill Freeman from MIT. And this is, I think, the coolest of the perspective things I'm going to show you. So I'm going to show you a video. Now, on the pre-side to the left, you're going to see the raw video input. So it's just a video of a man's face. But he's not moving, but it is actually a video. It's 9 seconds of video. And on the right side, I'm going to show you what they're able to glean from that video once they sort of zoom in, right? What they're going to do in this video is they're going to take very invisible, almost just minuscule changes in coloration as a function of heart rate, like that we would never be able to detect, but they're building the technology can do it. And what they're able to do is extract from video what your heart rate is. Watch this example. So on the left is going to be the live video, the actual feed. On the right is going to be the doctored feed. Now that's freaky, right? You wouldn't want to do that. You certainly wouldn't want to have a speed date with your face doing that. But they can do that. What does that mean? That means that they know your heart rate. Not only do they know your heart rate, they know the heart rate of the person you're interacting with. They know the extent to which, during the course of the interaction, your heart started beating as one. Right? They know not only are you excited or not that excited, they know about whether changes in your heart rate is diagnostic vis-a-vis the possibility of compatibility between the two of you. I could keep going in terms of what machine learning is doing in technology, but I'm going to start drawing to a close. The third major part of the talk is this part about implementation. So this part's the easiest. This is technology, but basically think Skype or Google Hangout, right? So there she is, that's the caller Alice, and she is and she's having an interaction with this guy, let's say this is Dave, right? And they have a 4-minute speed date, let's say, web-based speed date, and then of course here he is, and he's talking to her, and they're chatting about it, and the video's recording the sorts of information that I just talked about. The series type technology is getting the actual content of what they're saying. The video camera is starting to detect physiological sorts of measures. Facial coding expression going to be able to incorporate that information too. Then that date ends and we move on to the next date, etc. Now, imagine for a moment, and this, by the way, I'm just making it up, but imagine for the moment that we built a system that goes like this. We have a series of webcam-based speed dates. You sit at your computer and have a series of these sorts of speed dates or 4-minute interactions. Let's say after each interaction, you then indicate your level of interest. Maybe you report, 3 or 4 quick self-report questionnaires. Of course, the self-report matters too. I'm not saying we jettison the self-report in favor of these subtler measures. We use the self-report and also these machine learning type measures in order to get a fuller package. So let's say you do that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday from 7:30 to 9. That means you've committed 4.5 hours of your life to this, this sort of weird idea, right? But at the end of those 4.5 hours, you have had brief interactions with 60 different people in your community who are in the right sexual orientation for you and the right age range for you, and you have information not only about how was the initial banter via the web, which isn't perfect, but this is getting fairly close to face-to-face style if you've got the video and live interaction, and you have all these nonverbal indicators that we can all use, that we can use in our algorithm to start getting a sense not only the extent to which you have this subjective feeling of attraction, but also the extent to which you guys are showing non-conscious synchrony across a range of different channels. And I don't know if this will work. Let me just tell you, right? I've never built this. Nobody's ever tested this. But my hope, and I think I feel more confident than just hope, is that we might be able to build an algorithm that at least incrementally, maybe by 5% or 10% or 15%, increases above and beyond your self-reports the compatibility that you will have once you get face-to-face with somebody. Now, it doesn't take a whole lot of incremental value to make the world a lot better. What if we can use these algorithms to improve compatibility by 5%? Right? We use the algorithm to improve compatibility by 5%, to increase the likelihood by 5% that you really like the person you went on a first date with. So if you want to think about like global happiness in the world, if it's true that these relationships are crucial, that the compatibility is crucial, we can get things started on the right track faster and therefore, ideally, make the world a better place. So I thank you for your attention.
I want to thank the speakers for giving me an opportunity to comment in public on their talks. I'll try to use as little time as possible because I know all of you have lots of better questions than I do. I feel like a bit of a voyeur here. I have to confess that I got my first smartphone about 6 weeks ago. I don't use Facebook. I have no Twitter followers. I've never online dated. And I have WhatsApp on my phone, but I haven't used it yet. But I feel like a voyeur in another sense, too, and that is, and this was highlighted, I think, in Marion's talk especially, we get to look at what our adolescents are doing and saying with each other. At the very least in the general, and if you're good at snooping, you can maybe find out a little more. When I was an adolescent, there was no way my parents were going to find out anything about what we were talking about. And in fact, you know, the conversation that Marion presented about dope, I can tell you I had that conversation. But it was face-to-face, and there's no record of it. So I suspect that a lot of the kinds of things that people are talking about today are things that were going on before, except that they're going on speed now. There's a quote from C.S. Lewis that I've always liked, and that quote is, "Isn't it funny how day to day nothing changes, but when you look back, everything is different?" I think he got it exactly backwards. Isn't it funny how when we start looking at this stuff, it seems like things are changing minute to minute, but when you step back and look at it, maybe things aren't quite so different as they seem. That is, maybe some of the things that these folks are talking about and that we're seeing in adolescence in particular are the same sorts of issues and processes that we've always been talking about, but they're on speed now. Clearly, they're happening faster. And of course, we might ask ourselves, why are all the innovations coming from adolescence? You know, why is it that you know, us older folks aren't creating the innovations? And part of it is, of course, that adolescents are always more open-minded to anything new. But another part of it is that most adolescents are convinced that their parents are an epic fail, and this is going to be the new way of doing things, and this is going to be so much better, and this is going to be so much awesome, and this is going to be a way that we're going to set ourselves apart because we communicate this way, and it's like totally different. And of course, if we sit back a little bit, we can just sort of let them have their fun. So, you know, for example, the examples that we saw about adolescent deviant behavior. Well, these are all things that we know have gone on for a long time. They go on now, they go faster, they're more widespread, more people know about them, they have more impact, they have more lasting impact. So they're more influential, and we can talk about them being more potent in a lot of different ways. But in many senses of the words, they're simply the same things except accelerated. Or if we think about the kind of processes that Patti was talking about, self-presentation, well, that's certainly not a new invention, nor is self-disclosure, nor is sexual exploration. Nor is cultivating social resources. In fact, when reading the preliminary versions of the slides, I started thinking about Catcher in the Rye. Many of the things that Holden Caulfield does are things that we now talk about on the internet. And of course, Holden Caulfield didn't have the internet available to him. If we think about the kinds of social networks that Nicole was talking about, well, adolescence is expressly about wanting to know what everybody in your network is doing. I remember as a kid sitting there and making charts of who was talking to whom. I didn't know I was preparing myself for a career in social psychology. Mobilizing friends, maintenance, these are certainly the kinds of things that we've always wanted to do. And I think it's kind of interesting that you focused on weak ties, because thinking about it, adolescence is about weak ties. There's some stuff about intimate relations, but it's really about these weak networks that we have, and as we get older, of course, our networks shrink. So all this is kind of a good example of how you can use the social networks to develop some of the major themes of childhood. Or the examples that Eli was talking about. I really get a chuckle at what all these online dating firms are actually doing, because I remember filling out one of those questionnaires as an undergraduate, and that goes back to the 1960s. Now, they didn't have as good ways of processing them, and the computer took about 6 days, I think, to analyze my profile, and I don't think that's just because I was weird. The algorithms these folks used, as best we know, and I think we know pretty well, they're embarrassingly immature algorithms, to be honest. They're stuff that you could go into any social psychology class and construct in a half an hour, and they cloak them in fancy language, but they haven't yet had the gumption to try to test them in much more sophisticated model. And I think some of the examples that Eli presented, who knows if they'll work, but when I teach relationships to undergraduates, there's always one part of the class that I'm embarrassed by. And the part of the embarrassment is when they ask the question, who's going to be attracted to whom? And I have to say, I don't know. We don't know. 60 years of this work, yeah, we can narrow it down a little bit. If you're a religious fundamentalist, you're not going to be attracted to an atheist. If you're 20 years old, you're probably not going to be attracted to a 60-year-old. We can cut it down a little bit, but, that's not very impressive. Beyond that, so what Eli's describing is really short-circuiting the question. It's saying, I don't know who's going to have chemistry with whom. Let's let people interact in a meaningful way with as many people as possible and see what emerges. And who knows, maybe someday we will find out that people who have bigger muscles over here are more attracted to each other, and maybe DNA swabs will work, although I kind of doubt it. In another sense, though, I feel like a voyeur in all this, because everything that we're talking about today, I think this is great, and in 10 years it's going to be ancient history. And that's the really sort of depressing part of it. You have my pity, because your research careers are probably going to be dead in 10 years, unless you find something new. This kind of technology, it's already dying. I'm part of a group at NEAS who's exploring some of these things. Let me tell you a few of the things that are not just on the horizon, but they already exist, and now we just have to figure out how to kind of integrate them. Devices that allow you to hold hands with your partner anywhere in the world. This is something called the Frevel, by the way. You can look it up. Devices that you can put in your pillow that not only allow you to converse with a partner who might be on the other side of the world, but that will also vibrate to the other person's heartbeat, potentially even regulate temperature. The ability to interact through virtual reality with another person who's on the other side of the world, or perhaps even something artificial, including the kinds of interaction that I don't want to mention in public. Apps that allow you to have instant visual communication anywhere in the world with anyone, and in particular, apps that allow you to perspective take so that you can actually see the world the other person is experiencing. And of course, I'm talking about Google Glass, which I think was a pretty dismal failure, not because I think the technology is a bad idea, but I think they didn't have a good model for figuring out how to integrate it in people's lives. So these are the kinds of things that are on the horizon. There's a wonderful quote from E.O. Wilson, who said, humanity's real problem is the following: we have godlike technology, medieval institutions, and Paleolithic emotions. So the question is not what can we do in technology, the question is how does it get integrated into human social life. And what's interesting about that is that you then have to fall back on the same kinds of questions that we have about social life already. In what ways can social media complement existing interactions as opposed to substitute? And I think Nicole touched on this in a very nice way. I love your mentioning that it's not real and not real interactions. They're obviously just as real. At what point does online interaction become inauthentic? Think about the movie Her for a moment, which I assume at least some people in the room have seen. That kind of creation at some point became dysfunctional. I think they kind of jazzed it up in the wrong way in the movie because they made her character get weird, and then that's when he started to have trouble with it. But imagine that you had a presence such as her in your life. At what point would you get tired of it? And initially, we all probably would think it was fun, but at what point would you actually get tired of it? Could you even tell that it wasn't a real person? The Turing test for androids. To what extent can social media actually complement other kinds of relationships as opposed to being the primary basis for people's relationships? I think we don't really have answers to these kinds of questions yet, but I think that the way to address them is going to be to take the kind of perspectives that we've heard today and combine them with many of the kinds of models of social behavior that we've had all along. And of course, the beauty of this is that will require interdisciplinary research that takes academics and social scientists who are genuinely interested in these processes and technology entrepreneurs. Now, one of the problems here, of course, is the problem of money. And so you might want to ask yourself the question, why are we so fascinated by these kinds of technologies? If you follow CNN, there's some new technology every day, and lots of people click on them. Why are we so interested in them? Why don't we just sort of turn our nose at them? I think there are a couple of answers to that. I think one answer is the novelty of it is intrinsically self-expanding. There are many theories around about how people want to grow as human beings, how we want to expand our resources and our perspectives. The novelty in these forms of interactions it's exciting. It's really terrific to be able to do this kind of thing, and we feel like we're growing in a certain way. And I think that we want to explore by developing these new methods, but that, of course, requires that they stay new. The second thing, I think, is that there's something about the hyperdrive nature of these forms of connecting with other people that's highly diagnostic about the human condition for us and about our own personal circumstances. They tell us something about what's important to us, what we care about, how we want to connect to other people, how we want to meet our needs. And I think this is really a very fundamental and interesting question about the human condition, how we can find out so much more about what's meaningful to us. The idea that Eli mentioned, the idea of having 60 speed dates while sitting home, and I'd be in my pajamas, and then I'd use some kind of technology to cloak that. To be able to do that would be really wonderful. But to the extent that entrepreneurs are motivated by money as opposed to the interest value of this, then I think there's going to be a gap between how the science develops and how it might be used to really better the human condition, because we've seen in many instances where the drive to patent things and the drive to control the technology can actually interfere with the natural application of it, and I personally think that's why Google Glass died. It'll be back, but in a different form. So I guess this would be a good point to open this up to comments from other people, and thank you for your attention. Yes.
Hi. Does this work? Yeah. Hi, my question's for Eli. Hi. In your study with the speed dating and the language models, did you control for native speakers and whether or not those speakers were multilingual or bilingual?
Excellent question. No. In general, they were Northwestern University undergraduates, so most of them were, they were all fluent in English. Most of them were native speakers. I agree that with sort of a larger sample, if you were going to scale this up, you would need to account for those like cultural differences in the way syntactic structure gets stitched together, but we don't know yet. It's a good question.
Yeah, so because you're discussing algorithms and in specific prosody, when you have more than one language in your brain, it affects your prosody and it affects also your use of function words and your use of content words. So it's something I think you'd want to control for, at least in the future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
It's over there.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful presentations. I have one question. The kind of underlying thought is that the internet changes the nature of interactions or relationships. I wonder if it's not like we just keep interacting, but the nature of the internet allows us to analyze all the data in a really great way. We actually have access to the data, we have access to the data for children and all of that. So now we have actually a better view, but that doesn't change the underlying way of we are interacting. It's actually a question for all of you.
I'll start with adolescence. I think in many ways it's the same, and in some important ways it's different. So if you think about, adolescents have always been very concerned about what others think of them, concerned about how others view them, how others estimate them. They're struggling to understand their place in the social world. If you think about social media, it's sort of like rocket fuel for those concerns. You post something online and you can immediately see how many people like it, how many people comment. Not only are you watching how your own posts are received, you're seeing how everybody else's are. So you're constantly reading this giant feed of who's doing what with whom. And your friends' posts get way more likes and comments than yours do. And what does that mean about your place in the social world? So I think it's very similar. The content of what is said is similar, perhaps, but the audience it reaches is different. In the old days, we could not send everything to 1,000 people with the push of a button. And I think there's more of a chance to gauge how it is received in terms of likes, retweets, follows, whatever the platform is. And I think that means a lot, at least to adolescents. So that's one type of answer, but my colleagues probably have other thoughts.
I fully agree, and I also fully agree with Nicole that, for especially in our research, we as adults, we keep talking about on and offline world, but for adolescents, the on and offline world is completely intermingled. There is no on and offline world, and it's also that they mostly communicate with their existing friends through social media. And I hope that's probably the same. It's good. So all the and they primarily use the internet for communication purposes. So what we see is that all the problems, the social problems in adolescence, bullying, love, sexuality, they are now being communicated online. And that has changed, but the problems and the issues are still the same. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for such an interesting panel, and I really enjoyed all of the presentations, and it gives so much thought. It's really hard to come up with one question, so I have this kind of a prospective future-related question. So from everything what we know for today about research on social media and relationships, so, from present studies, what do we know? So what are, if summarize them all, what would be the positive effects of social media on relationships, and what are the negative effects of social media on relationships? And then if you can see the future, maybe your idea, so how in 20 years from now or more, how then social media will transform human relationships. So if you have any future vision of that, that would be interesting to hear. Thank you.
Wow. That's quite a...
Please don't mess up.
Yeah.
Get it right.
So I guess, I mean, I think the overall theme that I'm hearing and that Harry mentioned, that I think the enduring needs that we have as humans are consistent, and we are now looking to new ways of meeting those goals through the affordances of CMC. So I know Patty and I both look to Joe Walther for some of his really important work in kind of thinking about how CMC is different from face-to-face. It's not better, it's not worse, it has a different set of affordances, asynchronicity. I mean, I think if we look to some of the really, really early work on relationships and interpersonal communication in CMC, the guiding assumption was that face-to-face communication was the gold standard and everything else was somehow less rich or impoverished. And now I think it's clear that, you know, we have a different set of cues from online interaction. So maybe I can't see eye gaze, but maybe when I look at someone's online dating profile, I can see things that wouldn't be apparent face-to-face. I can see whether they know the difference between there, and there. Right? And if they use them incorrectly, I can make attributions about their education or the extent to which you know, how much time they're putting into this process. So I think in terms of your question of kind of how are things changing, or what will the future be, there's a great article that looks at the difference between being there and then beyond being there. It's Holland and Stornetta, I want to say. And basically the idea is that, you know, for a long time we focused on trying to create technologies that give us this same sensation of sharing time and space. And another way to go about doing this would be to not try to replicate face-to-face, but rather to kind of use these tools in new ways. And I think some of the work, for instance, that Eli's talking about with being able to use computer you know, algorithms and video data, right, and on the fly processing, that we would look to try to kind of capitalize on those affordances, but not necessarily try to replicate face-to-face. I think that's not. I think it's not going to happen, and I don't think it's as important as some of us seem to think it is.
I think one of the challenges in the future is abundance. How can we deal with abundance? And I think, you know, when we talk about raising children, I think teaching children self-control is one of the most important new parenting goals. Because, you know, all the technology is closer to our skin. You know, it was on the PC on the desktop, then it moved to our bag, the laptop, and now it's in our pocket. And you know, and all these apps, they scream for attention. And I think it's very, you know, I see many adolescents struggling with this abundance and with this, overwhelming number of different apps.
Just on the positive side, there was a lot of worry early on that texting would ruin young people's language and make them poor writers. And this hasn't been studied very systematically, but the few studies we have show that young people who text a lot actually have better language skills. The play that they do with language actually makes them better writers, so I think there's hope there. I'm impressed with the level of intellectual sophistication with which adolescents approach deciding where to post what, because they're all moving across multiple platforms, and they are very strategic in what they put on Facebook, where their parents or ministers or coaches might see, what they tweet, which is a wholly different audience, what they put on their personal blogs. I think that takes a lot of cognitive sophistication, and I'd love someone to study what this is all doing to their theory of mind, because they have to constantly think about who's reading this, who am I talking to? That takes a lot of cognitive sophistication, and I think it may be building some positive skills.
chime in as well. Building on Marion's point, yes, this is a very highly cognitively demanding set of things to navigate. It certainly is not the sorts of issues that our brain evolved to navigate. So the interesting question for me is, in principle, these sorts of technologies are democratic and egalitarian. In principle, now everybody has access to information, everybody has access to elite college courses. In actual fact, I think we've seen an exacerbation of inequality due to this sort of technology. Some people are increasingly sophisticated at this sort of thing, some people are less so. And I think most important, if I had to list the thing that I think is most important, is are we all going to be able to leverage this sort of technology to help bring up the people who might have the least privilege, or is it just going to supercharge the privilege of the people who started off as privileged? I have to admit, I'm less optimistic than I would like to be about that.
Andy?
Thank you for your talks. I guess my question is on the topic of abundance, but not among young people or tech users, but about researchers of relationships. The internet gives us a fire hose of people's most intimate thoughts, beliefs, their drug purchasing strategies. I'd like to know from each of you what you think the greatest ethical or science integrity challenge you think will be in the next 10 years, given that this is the direction things are taking.
I think the greatest ethical challenge we're going to have on this front is the movement toward data sharing. I think that there are large swaths of the field that really should not be posting this stuff at all. And I think that the discussion of like research ethics, right? There seems to be like one view of what ethical research is. It's more openness, more, right? And look, everybody can agree that as a general principle, openness and disclosure are good things. But I actually feel like if we're not careful, we're going to set up norms and possibly even rules that run the risk of severe privacy violations. And I have found that the people who are most actively advocating for these perspectives, to my mind, are insufficiently attentive. It's like, yeah, you can just protect it. But I mean, I have seen the private parts of our major movie stars, and I'm not upset about that personally, but I probably shouldn't have seen some of these things. Like the major banks have had these sorts of failures. The NSA has let up information. Like, I don't think we can be naive at all about which data can be cracked. So I think that is by far the biggest ethical threat to the sorts of data collection that people like us study, is overzealous adherence to the new movement toward openness.
I think user consent and figuring out ways of ensuring that people have some sense of what's happening with their data and some control over it. I don't know that the informed consent, as we currently are using it, I don't know that it works when you hand a piece of paper to an undergraduate before they take a survey, and I'm pretty sure it doesn't work when you ask them to click a button online. So I think we've seen a couple of instances where users don't necessarily understand what, the algorithm by which, for instance, Facebook is attempting to help them with the abundance problem in sorting the news feed. So I think that, and this I think goes back to Eli's point as well about the importance of skills, right? So understanding that kind of under the hood dynamics on the part of users, participants, and that they have some sense of what's happening with their data, I think is something we haven't even begun to figure out.
And I agree that the future is already now. What I think, and it's not about research, my husband and I were last week, we were both booking a hotel room at a certain point, and we had both our laptops, and then he had to pay $200 more for the same hotel room than I had to pay. And it was because there was a cookie on his computer. And so I think these are, the thing is that privacy is one thing, but they combine, when systems combine all the data from different sources, that's one of the most riskful future issues.
let me just add a thought here too, and I think uncritical endorsement of these technologies is a huge issue, and I'll give you just an example from personal experience. I'd been doing some consulting for the US Army, and the Army simply established Skype outlets so that soldiers who are away from home can communicate with the family back home. This turned out to increase divorces. Why did it increase divorces? Because here you have somebody who's out in the field and they're communicating with the person back home, and after the 5 minutes of the, oh, I miss you so much, it got in and, you know, damn it, the roof is leaking and there's no one here to help me fix it and I can't control the kids, so would you please tell them to do their homework? And it actually, and the guys are off in the field and, you know, they're worried about being killed, and I think there's a little too much uncritical acceptance. You know, you can't get a new drug through the FDA without doing careful randomized clinical trials of this kind of thing. How come we don't have randomized clinical trials of any of these things to see what their impacts are?
I don't really have anything to add. We have just a few more minutes. Are there other questions? Okay, the microphone's coming.
The microphone.
Well, you touched upon this a little bit already, but I wanted to ask you to expand this. You're getting a lot of data, but people using social media are also getting data about themselves and their relationships, almost quantitative data, like the number of likes. And also with the online matching, you get quantitative data about your potential relationships. What do you think that changes, introducing this quantitative element?
I think it's, I think it allows for more, I don't want to say gaming the system, but I think more conscious manipulation, right? So I've done some work looking at memorial pages on Facebook. And one of the things that we found was that people who created these pages then ended up seeing the number of likes, right, or the number of members in this particular group as some kind of indication of how worthwhile the life of this departed person was. And Alice Marwick and Dana Boyd have also done a lot of great ethnographic work kind of thinking about this quantification of self. So I think that there is, you know, that it enables this kind of feedback loop whereby we can, you know, put up a picture, and if it doesn't get the requisite number of likes, we can take it down and not have it threaten then our self-esteem. On the other hand, there's also some very nice work that Catalina Tomà at Wisconsin has done, where she's looking at the way in which profile creation and being on one's profile can actually have this self-affirming process, whereby we kind of, it allows us to feel better about ourselves after seeing the response from our network. So I guess I'm not, I think it depends, would be kind of the cop-out answer to that.
I worry a little bit about a very old idea, but one I think that is borne out by the little data that we have, and that's the rich get richer, the poor get poorer hypothesis, that people who have strong relationships and face-to-face interaction are also pretty socially competent and adept in what they do online. And those who are less adept, who are maybe more lonely or anxious or less socially skilled, are also that way online in ways that invite further rejection. I think we see some evidence of that in the work with adolescents. I'm especially seeing it in the project with 13-year-olds. I think there the quantification could be very harmful. It could be really distressing to those who keep putting themselves out there but don't get the peer affirmation that they see their more competent peers getting, often when doing the very same things, maybe just with a little shade of difference.
Yeah, one more question. So it's another philosophical one, I guess. So it's about the children and the new generation. So one of the ICANN representatives said that the internet is like a rainforest and it's developing so chaotically, and humans are have no opportunity to control it, and we just need to deal and research the different effects and influences on our society. But thinking about the next generation of children, do you think we need psychologists need to think maybe how to provide specific education on, I don't know, not just digital literacy, but education about adoption of these technologies and their usage in their social life, like, for example, internet etiquette, or I don't know, which things we need to teach to our children to maybe protect them, or so what psychologists should do, given to that fact. Yeah.
You know, we just agreed that for children, the on and offline communication have merged. So I think education should be, should of course also include the online environment of kids. And, we talked about that the main issues stay the same, but, at an early age, you see that the things are rehearsed and practiced and explored at an earlier age. So what you now see before pre-adolescence, when they start to get interested in intimate topics, we need to educate them, and it needs to be part of general parenting. I think you agree on that.
Oh,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think we do need to socialize children in the digital domain. I think a lot of parents are afraid, and we give up in that domain, and it makes no sense. We socialize children in every other context in which we send them, and I think we need to socialize them in their relationships online as well as offline. I think we are out of time. Yes. Thank you all so much for coming,
yes,
and
thank
thanks to APS for organizing this. Thank you so much.